Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the Johnson edition of the collected poems of Emily Dickinson. We turn now to poem 80, Our Lives Are Swiss. Now, this is an interesting poem. Emily, as we've commented already earlier in prior lectures about her background especially, she didn't do much traveling. She never traveled outside of the United States. So she talks about Switzerland, as she talks about Italy, as she talks about the Alps. It will be significant that she's playing games with places she's never been, but she researched and knew something about them. But I think this poem is a fascinating poem because of the way in which she can work on so many different levels, and I'll try and point that out as we go. Now, our assumptions that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that, speaking of some of that introductory stuff, I'm hopeful that you've had the experience of that. And I'm hopeful as well that you have worked through the previous 79 poems. We just finished with Going to Heaven. Now, in poem 124, if we can just go there for a moment, she said it this way: "In lands I never saw, they say immortal Alps look down, whose bonnets touch the firmament, whose sandals touch the town." And it is true, she never saw the Alps, and so as she makes the reference right away early on in this poem, Our Lives Are Swiss, and then she makes the comment about the Alps neglect, we're gonna be seeing that she's only making references to stuff she's never known. I'm going to be drawing in this lecture especially on two important scholars, Fars as well as Wendler. And Fars points out that there is a very practical way to read this poem. And before we read it, I just want to set you up to it. Emily spent her life with a whole lot of duties around the house that clearly she didn't enjoy doing all of them, although baking was one of those that she did enjoy, and gardening. But she spent a lot of time baking and gardening and sewing, nursing and canning. And Farr points out that all of these tasks were, in some regards, solemn in their importance, but they took her away, which will be our word Cyrene. They will take her away from the things that she really wants to do, which obviously is to write. Now, in some ways, we're back to earlier poems, 77, with the bars and the prison and all of that. I also want to point out that as we get ready to read this poem, pay attention to all the S sounds. Emily, of course, brilliant in her ability to move language with sounds. She says it this way. And do point out to yourself as well that there's 3 sentences here, all with exclamation points, so we want to work through that. Our lives are Swiss, so still, so cool, till some odd afternoon the Alps neglect their curtains, and we look further on, Italy stands the other side, while like a guard between the solemn Alps, the Cyrene Alps forever intervene. Now again, the construction of this poem around 3 sentences, each ending with an exclamation point, cannot be missed. Notice she'll begin with the pronoun our, as in she's speaking, it seems, for not just herself. Notice it isn't my life is Swiss, but rather our lives are Swiss. In other words, the country of Switzerland. And then she'll say it with this hyphen, so still. Again, her use of the word still is, I think, provocative. I think T.S. Eliot learned to use the word still from Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson especially. What is it that T.S. Eliot says? We must be still and still moving, right? In other words, Swiss, so still, so cool, these lives of ours, till some, and then I love the use of the word odd afternoon, the Alps neglect their curtains and we look further on. Now, think about the Alps in this poem as being that, well, like bars or prison in the previous poem, 77. The thing that keeps us from what we really want, right? The Alps stand in the way between Switzerland and Italy, right? And we look further on. Notice that when we're talking curtains, there will seem to be a certain kind of femininity about that use of that word. And then later when we get to guard, it will be the more masculine rendering of the two. And again, notice the use of the word look. The Alps, every once in a while, the clouds will clear and we can see from Switzerland Italy, right? And of course, Italy will be the thing that we want. What in some readings of this poem, scholars have pointed out, the Eden of this poem, the thing we want, the thing we're hoping for, the El Dorado, if you will. Of course, the minute that she uses the word look, we can't help but think of Republic in Plato's Republic 7 and that notion of perspicacity, as we've commented on it a number of times. she says in a brief sentence interluded in between the three sentences, Italy, notice italicized, stands the other side. In other words, there is Switzerland, that ordinary life, and then there's Italy on the other side of the Alps, that amazing life, if you will. It is a form of paradise or Eden. And then the final sentence, while like a guard, and now all of a sudden, easily I think you can get there to say there's a lot of Genesis 3 and there's a lot of Milton's Paradise Lost that's being played with here. So that, for example, the mountains almost serve like guard, or again, she used earlier curtains, but the idea of bars, something, a wall of some kind or another, while like a guard between, and then she'll use two adjectives to describe the Alps. The solemn Alps, the serene Alps, the Cyrene Alps, which in one moment she's playing with two different, notice, word pictures here. In terms of the guard, I think she's referencing, in some ways, the Genesis 3:24 Garden of Eden story, where God's flaming sword is there to disallow Adam and Eve from returning. And to that degree, we're now thinking about the possibility of Eden. Now, in poem 211, Emily will play around with this idea, come slowly, Eden, lips unused to thee bashful, sip thy jasmines as the fainting bee. And I think that I think Werdler is making a very powerful argument here that in some ways Emily is playing around with the idea that we live in paradise until we can't, and then we're jettisoned, and we always want to get back. And the Alps are what keep us from being able to witness it. The idea of Paradise Lost, of course, you'll remember those opening lines that will speak to the idea of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose death brought death into the world and all our woe, until one greater man, the Christian theology that allows for it is the one greater man that overcomes the Alps of woe and death in that theodicy. And I think here she is playing with an interesting theodicy, but she uses the word forever intervene, which leads that leads us back to the idea of the Odyssey. You'll remember in Odyssey 12, lines, especially 153, the Cyrenes are these scary women. We've given full lectures on this at learnstrong.net. You'll remember they're these scary women that will sing and call towards Odysseus and his man. Odysseus' men, of course, have wax in their ears. Odysseus tied to the mouth so that he can hear the song of the Cyrenes. What do the Cyrenes represent? Well, they represent the thing that keeps you from getting home to Ithaca. But in all of these renditions, there is some sense that there is a way to finally get to, if we can now bring it back to the poem, get back to Italy. But notice here, the Alps are going to forever intervene. And if you follow far, then maybe Emily's simply saying, these household duties of mine are forever going to keep me from doing the kinds of poetic construction that I really want to do. Of course, that's amazing given that she wrote at least 1,775 poems, of which we are now, of course, exegeting each one of them in order. And so it's pretty remarkable. I mean, it does beg the question, if Emily had lived without the Alps, without those things forever intervening, what kind of poet would she have been able to become? Well, that's an interesting question. What are we going to do with a poem like this at 2a? Well, I think the argument that she's making is that sometimes what we want is forever blocked. And we have to get used to that disappointment. Of course, Paradise Lost again comes to mind here, right? At 2b, I love all the S sounds of this poem. Go back and read it for yourself. I love the symbolism of the mountains like bars, and of course as Italy being that form of heaven or Eden, the good things, if you will. And the Alps are kind of like the reality, that we're kind of stuck in Switzerland as opposed to getting to Italy. Nothing to speak against Switzerland, obviously, but it's cool. That is to say, it's normal. It's the routine, if you will. And then at 2b, I also love the fact that she has this poem broken up into 3 sentences, each with an exclamation point. And of course, Emily loves her trinities. And speaking of trinities, obviously, we're playing around at 3a with the idea of the Genesis 3 passage, as well as, of course, the Milton's Paradise Lost passage. And as we mentioned, poem 211 as it relates to Eden. Finally, at 3b, how are we going to own a poem like this? What was a time when you struggled against your Alps to be able to get to your Italy? I hope that Emily is challenging you. Thank you.